Hi, everyone. My name is Shima. I'm from the Iranian Association at the Arts University OCAD in Ontario. I wanted to welcome you in English and tell you a little bit about our confederation. About 100 days ago, Iranian students outside of Iran from America, Canada, and Europe got together and had a few meetings. And these meetings led to these things that I'm going to read for you. I hope that you can continue to support us. Thank you for joining us today. The purpose for this confederation is as follows: amplifying the voices of the student movement in Iran, supporting Iranian students outside Iran across the world, strengthening the connections of Iranian students between inside and outside of Iran, defending freedom of speech and thought of all Iranian students at academic institutions across the world, creating a platform to enhance open discussions, idea exchange, and collaboration among student activists, promoting academic discourse and intellectual collaboration among the Iranian communities outside of Iran, facilitating intergenerational learning from the experiences of student activists of past generations, raising awareness about and supporting detained and expelled students in Iran, and also creating a structure for local, regional, and worldwide support for each other. Thank you for joining us. I'm going to pass it to Sara Eskandari, our host today. Thank you.
Thank you, Shima Jan. In the name of Women, Life, Freedom. Hi, everyone. My name is Sara Eskandari, and I am a PhD candidate in history at the University of Pennsylvania. I really appreciate everyone taking the time to attend this informative discussion concerning nonviolent protest and its effects on protests. Before I mention why we chose this topic, I would like to ask you all to share your questions with us as we'll ask the ones that receive the most likes at the end of the panel. The topic of nonviolence protest is one of the most important issues to address when you are discussing protests, movements, and movements demanding change for many reasons. Still, I will only mention three regarding Iran's current protest movements, both in Iran and worldwide. So the first is violence was, as we all know, undeniably institutionalized by the Islamic regime right after they took over in 1979, and has been internalized over the past 4 decades. So the regime has implemented the violence at all levels, from law to culture and even tradition. Regardless of religion, ethnicity, class, or gender, most Iranians have experienced some level of violence, whether physically, mentally, or emotionally. And I will not fail to mention those that have suffered more than others, primarily those from subalterns or marginalized groups like the Kurds, Baluch, religious minorities, and women in general. Second, the fact that violence has been internalized and legalized by the regime, and that most Iranians have experienced some sort of violence, does not mean that we can minimize its personal and collective consequences. As Iranians, we cannot really normalize violence, saying, oh, you were in prison, you were lashed or detained, by the morality police. It happens to most Iranians, so not a big deal. So I think this thought process disregards people's, experiences and, insinuating that their pain and suffering caused by violence is not, legitimate. So I think we must never normalize violence. And last but not least, although we Iranians have been persecuted for years and oppressed on many different levels, we as a people have proven that we have avoided violent resistance from the very beginning of the Islamic Revolution of 1979. When women took to the streets and peacefully protested against the mandatory hijab and were, attacked violently. When the Green Movement, peacefully demonstrated against the fraudulent elections and were brutally suppressed. And when during the bloody Aban, the regime violent response to their, peaceful protest were bullets, causing over like 1,500 deaths. So as we, have seen this past year, the regime continues to respond to peaceful protests with deadly violence. Yet, despite unending atrocities, unprecedented persecution, and physical violence, we Iranians, have continued to resist peacefully. This was emphasized by Farhad Meisami, translator of the book Nonviolent Handbook, a guide for practical action. Mr. Meisami has been detained and tortured, as many of you know, in an Iranian prison. Yet, despite these circumstances, he, continues to encourage nonviolent resistance. I cannot imagine the difficulty of being in the prison, tortured, and, I'm assuming full of anger, right? Still being able to encourage others to continue opposition peacefully. So at this time, I would like to read, a few lines of Meisami's introduction, first in English, then in Farsi, because I believe his words are essential to hear when discussing nonviolent resistance, especially because, they are the words from one who has suffered such extreme violence for his beliefs. Okay, I'm gonna bring it up and read it for you all. Okay. When pent-up anger in society has reached a critical point and is on the verge of exploding, it is understandable that nonviolent resistance would be marginalized. In my opinion, however, the path to prosperity for the Iranian people depends solely on understanding the importance, seriousness, and continuity of nonviolent resistance. In this situation, perhaps those who consider this effort are like those who continue to play on the deck of a sinking ship until the last moment. However, I'm sure that not far off in the future, young people from this region, while recovering, reconstructing, and discovering the past, will begin to understand the deeper historical consequences of violence. With the help of generational experiences and knowledge, they can make sure everyone knows how to build a ship and how to navigate it, so it is not constantly in danger of sinking. Perhaps we can play tomorrow as we continue tuning our instruments on the same sinking deck. Farhad Meisami, fall 2022, Rajai Shahr prison. So I'm gonna read the Persian version. Okay. در شرایطی که خشم فروخورده جامعه به نقطه بحرانی و نزدیک به انفجار رسیده، قابل درک است اگر سخن از مبارزه خشونت پرهیز به حاشیه رانده شود. من اما عمیقاً معتقدم که مسیر خیر و شکوفایی آینده مردمان ایران تنها در گرو درک اهمیت، جدیت و استمرار مبارزه خشونت پرهیز است. شاید کسانی این نوع تلاش‌ها را در این شرایط مشابه کار آن نوازندگانی بدانند که بر عرشه یک کشتی در حال غرق شدن تا آخرین لحظات همچنان به نواختن ادامه می‌دهند. من البته امیدهایی بس بیش از اینها دارم اما اگر چنان باشد هم مطمئن هستم چندان دور نخواهد بود آن روزی که جوانانی پرمایه از این مرز و بوم مجموعه آن نطق‌های نواخته را بازیابی، بازسازی و کشف رمز کنند و در پی درک عمیق‌تر تاریخیشان درباره عواقب خشونت و با افزودن هوشمندی‌های نسلی خاص خودشان راهی برسازند که طی آن همگان بتوانند بدانند که چگونه کشتی بسازیم و چگونه ناوبریش کنیم که مدام در معرض خطر غرق شدن نباشد. پس اجازه بدهید بر همان عرشه در حال فرو رفتن همچنان سازهایمان را کوک کنیم و همچنان بنوازیم، شاید برای فردا. فرهاد میثمی، پاییز 1401، زندان رجای شهر. I'm really honored to introduce an outstanding scholar, a peace activist, a nonviolence mentor, and a professor emeritus of classics and comparative literature at UC Berkeley, Dr. Micheal Negler. Dr. Negler has published many books and articles, as well as contributed written chapters to numerous books. So his well-known accomplishments include The Search for a Nonviolent Future, The Third Harmony, Nonviolence and Human Destiny in the 21st Century, and the Nonviolence Handbook, a guide for practical action, which was translated by Meisami, as you all know. So Dr. Negler is a prolific, scholar, and I could list, his accomplishments, but it could, I'm sure, take hours, and I'm sure you would rather hear him speak. So without further ado, I invite Dr. Negler to the podium to tell us more about his research and experiences with nonviolent protests, and to share what he feels about the correlation between the women life freedom movement and nonviolent resistance, and actually how our group and others can be more effective using nonviolent resistance. Dr. Negler, please. We can't hear you. Could you please unmute yourself?
Did that work?
Yes.
Oh, good. I was saying, Sarah, what a delight it is to see you and hear from you and share with you what little I have been able to learn about nonviolence. I am deeply committed to being of any help that I can possibly be with this present movement in Iran. And this is not a new thing with me. I had Iranian students back in 1979, and I worked with them. And so, this is almost a kind of tradition. I think from what you do know, by the way, do you not, Sarah, that Dr. Meisami has been released? Yes, okay.
Yes, he recently released, yes, thankfully.
Yes, he's now eating, and I hope to hear from him soon. I wanted to mention also that you talked about the book, The Third Harmony. There's also a film with that title, The Third Harmony, and it's even available with Farsi subtitles. And I don't have that link right in front of me, Sarah, but I can send it to you, and you can share that with everybody.
That would be perfect. Thank you so much.
We'll do that. Yeah, and make a little note to myself. The first thing I want to say, I guess, is that the violence of the regime, which is chronic and intense, and to which they are apparently committed, is actually our strength. That is their weakness and our strength. That is going to bring about their downfall. But in order for that to happen, we cannot be like them. That's why when we use violence, there's really nothing for the people to choose between us and the regime. When we use nonviolence, there's suddenly a very inspiring choice that people have. And I don't know if this is the right point, Sarah, for me to mention this, but I would really recommend that people in diaspora and in the country, if possible, to have a discussion, a national conversation about what kind of Iran do we want. And because the reason I say this is that if we're doing just protest, then we are only touching the tiny fragment of the power of nonviolence. You know, protest is the least important aspect of nonviolence. It is good for a start to get people to know that they're not alone, to serve notice to the regime that what they are doing is not acceptable. But then we have to take the initiative. Protest is reactive. We're letting the regime do something that we don't like and pushing back against it. Now, there's a role for that. We have to do that, of course. But even more important, we have to be constructive. We have to be creative. We have to make a proposal about this is the Iran that we would like to live in, and here's how we're going to get there. So knowing about nonviolence is extremely important. And I'm happy to say that, you know, when I started in this field, when I started in the field of nonviolence, I used to say that the average bank robber is more conscious of what he's doing than the average protester. But that was a long time ago. So I'm happy to say that by now, we have learned a great deal about nonviolence and how it works. So, for example, just to mention one book, there's a professor at Harvard. She appears in our film. Her name is Erica Chenoweth. And she, with a friend, Maria Stefan, wrote a book called Why Civil Resistance Works. So they use the term civil resistance. I prefer the term nonviolence, but it was a very good study. They studied more than 200 episodes of nonviolence, which are increasing in frequency as time goes on. And they showed that 60% of them were successful. Whereas with nonviolence, I'm sorry, when people chose violence, only 23% were successful. And at that, only successful in the short term, not successful in creating a more democratic, more free regime in the future. So I want to add, I guess, that Gandhi felt, and I also feel, that women have a special capacity to be nonviolent, and they should use it. But that does not mean being passive. It means being creative and being protective. And in this way, they really will have a great strength. Let's see, what else can I say? There is a resource now, which is only a few years old, called the Global Nonviolent Action Database. And it is online, GNAD, and it is physically located at Swarthmore, which is not too far, Sarah, from where you are. And that lists more than 1,000 episodes of nonviolence and classifies them. Was it a women's movement? Was it a regime change? Was it in favor of democracy? So there's a tremendous amount now that leaders in the movement can learn and apply. I'll just mention one other thing before, if you'll allow me, before we go on to the next question. One of the things that developed long time ago in the Spanish Civil War was known as affinity groups, grupos de afinidad. And what that means is instead of being 5,000 people out on the street, we collect into groups that we all have the same goal, but we need to get to know one another so that we can support one another. I mean, even a military army will do this. And so we have affinity groups on spirituality and nonviolence and associated topics. So I would strongly recommend that the women and the men who are in the movement now would think of getting together in groups, which will be much easier in diaspora than it is in Iran, but probably not impossible in Iran. And, you know, always to take courage, because as I want to end where I began, the violence of the regime is their weakness, and our nonviolence is our strength.
Thank you so much, Dr. Negler, for this really important information and your enlightening viewpoints on women life freedom, your opinion about the regime, and your great recommendation for Iranians that we should speak up what we exactly want to have a better Iran. Yeah. And protest is not enough. Yeah. So that we need to be creative, and our creativity would help us write a proposal about what kind of Iran we want. Yeah. And specifically, I really like you mentioned Gandhi and his feelings about women, that women have, especially have the capacity of to be nonviolent. But I really like the fact that it doesn't mean that they should be passive. It doesn't mean to be passive, but to be more innovative and creative, and that is so true. And I think that really our creativity and innovativity would help us push this revolution forward. So, Dr. Negler, based on your comments, I also would like to raise two questions, especially given that many of the attendees are inside Iran at the moment. Mm-hmm. And the idea of, nonviolent resistance might not be easy for them.
It's not easy for anyone, Sarah.
Exactly, especially because they personally are viewing daily violence from the regime and its effects, So the first question is, what mechanisms or tools are necessary, you think, for nonviolent resistance within student movements? And how can students effectively lead, nonviolent resistance among its, supporters? And the second question is, how can we raise awareness that nonviolence resistance is possible, actually, and highly effective? Because, it's very hard, Mm-hmm. Some may believe that it's extremely difficult to participate in nonviolent resistance, and to reach their goals, believing that it's just a theory, and almost impossible given the, the violent nature of some, totalitarian regime, like the Islamic regime. Like the Islamic Republic, So yeah, I would like to hear your thoughts on these questions.
Well, they are many, Sarah. You will not be surprised to hear. One thing that we can bear in mind is that the suffering. Okay, let me start that again. There's one tool which is fundamental, and that is never to hate persons. You can hate what they are doing, and you can hate that from the bottom of your soul, but you do not hate them as people. You are persuaded that what you're doing is a help to them because their violence is harming them as much as it is harming you. Fortunately, I mentioned that we are learning as we go along here. Fortunately, there's even a term for this now. It's called moral injury. And we can prove scientifically that when soldiers, for example, do harm in battle, even though they think they're fighting for freedom and all of that, the harm that they do reacts on them. So we can avoid moral injury by this main tool that I'm stressing here and that I always stress, that is not to hate the persons. The point I'm getting at, I guess, is when they are being violent, when they're giving those lashes and the imprisonment, etc., and even killing people, it's hurting them. So we owe it to them as fellow citizens of Iran, as fellow human beings. We owe it to them to stop them from their violence. And if that is our attitude, that we're doing it for your sake, then we get a tremendous amount of power and look for different things to do beyond just protesting. Protesting nowadays we call sometimes collective action, but there's also a very important role for dispersive action, for things that people do in little groups, in little households, rather than collecting together and being a target for assassination or violence. So one of the most important things that we've learned in recent years, and the film will emphasize this, is training. If I think myself, although I'm subject to correction because I'm not in Iran, I love the country, but I'm not in it. If we were to take some time out from protesting, but not lose momentum, use that time to do training in nonviolence, learning the history, learning the theory, and especially practicing being nonviolent in intense situations. You may be aware that in the civil rights movement in the South of the United States, people did what they call role plays. They would act out, I'm being a protester in a lunchroom, and you are the policeman who's dragging me out of here, or still worse, you're the citizen who's trying to kill me. And they acted out those dramas so that when they got into the situation, they were not shocked, they were not disoriented. They would say, I know what to do in this situation. So these trainings are now available from our group, the Meta Center, from the Nonviolence International in Washington, D.C., and from many other organizations in the US and in Europe. There are training manuals and how we can prepare people to be more effective and quite probably suffer less in actions that they have to engage in. The next thing, of course, you can tell I'm getting rather carried away, Sarah. The next thing, of course, is to have a good list, a repertoire of tactics, and use the appropriate tactics at the appropriate time. To be flexible. One of the things I've noticed about people in nonviolence is they get fixated on a particular symbol. One of the worst examples was the Chinese students when they got fixated on one piece of real estate. We're going to occupy this square, Tiananmen Square. The goal was not Tiananmen Square. The goal was democracy. But they got stuck on this symbol and they were massacred. It was terrible. So that shows us that we have to be flexible. We have to be light on our feet. We have to have a variety of tools and know when to use which one.
Thank you so much, Dr. Negler, for providing us with your valuable thoughts and your important information that is really thought-provoking, especially for those, that want to effectively make change. I really like the fact that you said, we need to avoid hatred. We should not hate people, but just their actions. And hatred, definitely would help them.
Yep.
Also, I really appreciate you for mentioning the extent to which training, would help us to have a nonviolent resistance in this really extraordinary situation.
Yeah.
Dr. Negler, it's time to turn our audiences for questions. Please, everyone note that we only have 20 to 25 minutes for this section, so we are very time limited. So we have chosen those questions that receive the most likes. So I'm gonna bring them up. Okay. Okay. The first question, Dr. Negler. If violence is part of your enemy's values and backed by ideology, should we continue to refrain from violence? Is there ever a breaking point for nonviolence resistance? Can we consider any deadline for nonviolent resistance in order to change the strategy?
Well, you may not be surprised to hear, Sarah, that this will be probably the fourth time that I'm answering this question, including most recently this morning with another group of Iranians. There's a gray area, as I like to call it, in between the blackness of violence and the blazing light of nonviolence. There's a gray area where we may have to use force. For example, if you had the opportunity to protect a group of women who are protesting, and there is a band of Basiji coming at them, you have the ability to get in the way. You may have to use force to protect those women. But force by itself is not necessarily violent. Again, if you can do this without hatred, and of course it's very difficult, but if you can do this to protect and to rescue rather than to injure, that gives you a great deal of inner power, which communicates itself into the situation. That is another dimension of nonviolence learning that's come up only in the last 20 years or so, is the question of mirror neurons, that you have neurons in your brain that are mirroring what I'm saying and how I'm feeling. So when you can confront an attacker without hatred, you're actually creating neural networks, or you're activating neural networks in that person's brain to change his behavior. And we can feel very good about that, because it means that when we're nonviolent, we are actually, to some degree or other, but definitely making other people nonviolent. And there will come a point when people who have been part of the oppressive regime, they can't stand it anymore and they want to get out. We have to be ready to welcome them, to help them, to understand them, and not to hate them for what they have done. Of course, there's a risk here. They might be provocateurs. They might be faking it. Generally speaking, I think we should be able to tell. But I think being able to accept people when they convert, when they no longer want to oppress you and hate you, is an important aspect of the flexibility and the creativity I was talking about.
Thank you so much, Dr. Negler. So let me ask the next question. Reza is asking, what are best nonviolent actions we can do in our small group?
I think the first one is maybe doesn't sound very dramatic, but it's learning. If I have found my own experience that knowing particular examples of nonviolence has been very helpful in my own work and in my own political activism. For example, people always used to say it never would work against the Nazis. Or of course, now they're saying it won't work against the Basiji. But as a matter of fact, there was one episode of nonviolent resistance in Berlin in 1943 at the height of the Nazi dictatorship. And it was highly successful. It's called the Rosenstrasse prison demonstration. And what happened was a number of men who had not been arrested before because they had non-Jewish wives. These Jewish men were arrested, something like 3,000 of them, and they were getting ready to deport them to concentration camps when the wives showed up and stood there in the street and said, "We're not going to let you do this." And Hitler said, "I can't handle this." It was too hard for him. So he appointed some other people. And at the end of one weekend of this protest, those men were released. And many of them survived the entire war. So that, I think, is a wonderful example of how nonviolent can work against an extremely oppressive regime. Of course, it's risky. Of course, you're going to suffer, but you're already suffering. The question is, do you want your suffering to work, to do some good, or do you want it to just end up in misery? If you take the initiative, if you act without hatred, your suffering can actually redeem your cause. There's a slogan that we sometimes use that unearned suffering is redemptive.
Thank you so much. That was a great example.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
So true, Dr. Negler. I'm gonna ask you this question. I think it's also from Reza. I'm not sure. He's asking if you see any good outcome in the Iranian diaspora's actions outside the country, such as demonstrations in the capitals of Europe and North America, petitions for finishing of the nuclear deal talks with which are like already comatose or boycotting and designating IRGC. Does that do any good to us inside the country and for the ultimate goal of making the government responsible for its actions and making it change course? What do you think?
I think yes. I think in two ways. For one thing, people who do violence like to stay in the dark. They don't like their acts to be exposed. So when you bring attention to what's going on in Iran, outside of Iran, it helps to bring about that change of heart that we're trying to create in the regime. Not in the whole regime all at once, but in some people, some here, some there, some here, some there, and pretty soon they have no powers left to exploit or oppress. So that's the first thing. And the second thing is that people who are in diaspora, who are not under the oppressive thumb of the regime, can do things that people inside the country couldn't do or would be, suffering extreme risk if they tried to do. So again, learning about nonviolence, training, and having conversations about the kind of Iran that we want. And historically, this has always been very helpful for people who are entrapped in a very oppressive regime.
Thank you so much. So next question from Lucy, if I'm pronouncing, name correctly, I'm not sure. So which historical or contemporary non-violent movements are most comparable to the Iranian one in regard to the conditions they were fighting and could serve, partly as role model for the current movement?
Whoa. That's a very important question. The one I mentioned is not a bad example, the Rosenstrasse prison demonstration right there in Berlin. I'm sorry, I can't quite think of any right off the top of my head, Sarah, but I believe that that resource that I mentioned for you, the Global Nonviolent Action Database, which is probably only a couple of 100 miles from where you are, it's well indexed. And so you could look it up in various ways, actually, there is a book or an article that might be helpful here. It's by a man named Ralph Summy, Summy, and it's called Nonviolence and the Case of the Extremely Oppressive Regime. So it's perfect for your situation. And I read it recently, and it does have some very useful suggestions. But I think the most useful suggestion of all is to remember that the regime is being very oppressive because it doesn't have a good ideology. It's weak. And so there's a concept nowadays that we call the paradox of repression, where in order to get you to stop what you're doing, they have to repress you. But the more they repress you, the worse they look, and the weaker they become.
Yeah.
So this paradox is something that we can also use to our advantage.
So true. Thank you. So many questions. Afshin is asking, since institutional violence has been woven into the very fabric of the society, and with the public arena being dominated by the regime, how do you think we can culturally move towards nonviolent discourse?
Boy, so I think if we look at what Gandhi did when he began to have some power, when it began to be obvious that the British would not be able to hold India indefinitely, he looked at every institution in India, the ones that the Indians themselves had created, the ones that the British imposed on them, and he made a kind of triage. Some of them, he said, this is absolutely useless. Out it goes. We're not going to do this anymore. No more executions, for example. This one basically had a good idea, but it went wrong. So we can reform it. And this type here, this group here is fine. We can leave it as it is. So that would be part of the conversations that I'm recommending that Iranians have among themselves as to, what institutions in our country are intolerable and have to simply be gotten rid of, which ones had a good idea originally, but it got, off base somehow. It's been exploited, which is very common. Those are to be reformed. So there's some that are to be gotten rid of, some to be reformed, and some don't need much work.
Great. Thank you.
Yeah.
I'm just looking at these questions, and because of our limited time, I just want to jump into the next question. You mentioned in your book the 3 stages of conflict escalation. In which stage are we in Iran?
Wow. Yeah, that question is easy to answer, I'm afraid. We're in the 3rd stage because people are being killed. And the opposition has so far not listened to us. However, I would say this, that we should never neglect an opportunity to speak with the opposition. even if we think they're not going to listen to us. As long as we think that they're not going to use it against us, they're not going to use it as an excuse to arrest us and put us in prison. As long as there's an opportunity to speak, we should never fail to assume that they might be reached. Then, if we try to reach them and they won't listen, then our nonviolence is very strong. Whereas if we try resistance before we give them a chance to explain what they're trying to do, we won't have so much power. So by and large, I think we ought to go through the motions of inviting regime members, and as well as Iranians in general, influential Iranians outside the country, like yourself, inside the country, to have this conversation and explain to them why what they're doing is unacceptable and the kind of Iran that they want to have. Then it will be partly successful, even though that success may not be visible. This is where something works sometimes, even though it doesn't seem to work. When we've had those conversations and they've not been listened to, the next thing we have to do is what the Iranian women have done. They have tried to use nonviolent resistance. When that doesn't work, we get to a situation, unfortunately, which Gandhi called do or die. We have to decide, how important is this to us? Is this perhaps something for which we are willing to die? And now, if you consciously make that risk, it's very different from just passively being killed. It can have a tremendous power. Most of the time when people say, this is something for which I am willing to lay down my life, most of the time they don't lose their life in the process.
Thank you, Dr. Negler. Again, I need to jump into the next question. So many great questions. And when the media and mainstream places the nonviolent activists alongside oppressive governments and introduces them as continuation seekers or repressive arms, what should be done?
Well, that's a very painful situation when we do the right thing, when we take a great risk, when we try to we try to help our country and the media don't understand. It's very painful. And I'm afraid it's been going on. It's been going on forever, but like a lot of other things, fortunately, it is changing. The media are slowly becoming more aware of what nonviolence really is. And for that reason, many campaigns that are well planned have a media person whose job it is to communicate with the media. That's a very important job. And the media are usually very happy to hear from you. They need material, they need a story. And, if they're not under complete oppression, so that they have some ability to express, what they're really hearing from the people, then they will be very eager to hear what you have to say. So to have a person who's well trained as a media coordinator is very, very helpful in long-term movements. And this is certainly a long-term movement that we're doing in Iran now. Oh, and by the way, Sarah, I know we're not going to have a chance to answer all these questions. You can certainly email me a list of questions and I'll try to answer them, and I'll even get some friends of mine to help.
Yeah, so we have so many questions, but our time is limited. So I think I just want to thank everyone for asking great questions. And of course, Dr. Negler, thank you for your informative, really, answers. And sadly, as I mentioned, our time has ended. And but I would like to personally and professionally thank Dr. Negler for accepting our invitation and taking the time to be with us today. And your words really will continue to encourage and motivate us. And thank you all for attending this meeting. Your presence means a lot to the Confederation. And I know that like really 1 or 2 hours a meeting to discuss violence and nonviolent resistance is not enough at all, especially given our current, extraordinary situation in Iran. So we will continue to organize more webinars on this topic. So please stay tuned and reach out to us with your suggestions, questions, as we can only, be successful with your help. So, and please remember, either all together or all alone. یا همه با هم یا همه تنها. Have a great rest of the day. Thank you, Dr. Negler.
You're so welcome, Sarah. Thank you for giving me this opportunity.